Hi guys. Next video we're going to do, I have to go backwards here in the slides, is going to be for Chapter 10, part of Unit 5, which is land use and agriculture, along with mining. Any way that we're going to use the land is going to be covered in this chapter. It's a big unit, so there's going to be a few videos as we're going through covering the information. So when we look at the learning targets, there's a little bit of difference than what we did last year because this year we're going to definitely cover how our human land use affects the environment, and it's going to be both from a positive standpoint and from a negative standpoint, because we're going to have environmental harm we're going to do, but we're also going to have environmental benefit from using the land also. That's going to get into externalities and the positive and negative externalities. This is the learning target that I'm not too worried about meeting because, again, College Board put out new restrictions or new requirements as far as what the eligible content was. I haven't seen anywhere in there about public land use, what type of public lands we have available. So we're going to kind of ignore those and kind of touch on them in passing, but I don't think you need to focus too much effort on those. So first off, when we look at our land usage, we need to look at the ways we're going to use it. We're going to use it for some sort of resources or entertainment, enjoyment, things like that. So anytime we're using the land, it's going to alter it in some way. If we're harvesting resources from it, for instance, we're going to cause habitat destruction. If we're using it for recreation, we're going to walk through the forests, we're going to create paths. Those paths are going to impact the environment in some way. So it doesn't matter what we're using it for, it's going to alter the ecosystems. And we can't always agree on how to use it and how to manage it. Different people have different priorities. Some people say we need to protect the land at all costs because there's that inherent beauty in it and we need to maintain the beauty. Other people are saying that we need to be able to harvest resources while still maintaining it because our economy is important. So the more people you have involved, the harder it is to manage and maintain it. When we look at those management issues, we look at three big concepts: the tragedy of the commons, the externalities associated with the usage, and our maximum sustainable yield. The first video that we're here with today is going to be the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is a huge problem, and these other two kind of tie into that a little bit, and you'll see that when we get to the videos for those. But for right now, we're going to focus on the tragedy of the commons. It's a very important thing that shows up on the AP exam in at least one way, most of the time a couple ways every year. So in class, we did this lab where we were fishing for goldfish, and the goldfish had different monetary values. And we showed that as people were interested in their own self-interest, making as much money as they could, the ocean fisheries eventually went extinct. We overfished them to the point where there was no fish left. If you were not in class, it would benefit you to come in and talk with me during QRT to make sure that you guys understood how that lab worked and how it showed the tragedy of the commons. If you were in the class, then you already know what that was. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about tragedy of the commons, what goes into it, and what it really means as far as its usage, because again, super important concept. So first thing we need to know is what a common area is. A common is any area that has open and equal access, meaning where anybody can use it. I was going to put equally, but open, equal access to it. It's a place where anybody has access, anybody can use it. Nobody owns it though. It's going to be a public area, or it's going to be run by the government, but everybody within that area can still use it. You know, people can travel, go visit a park, for instance. They don't own the park, the government owns the park, but we're the ones that pay taxes towards its usage, so we're able to use that park as well. So they have open, equal access. There's no regulation, or I don't want to say no regulation on it, but there's no restrictions on its availability to a certain group of people. Everybody has access to it. So when we look at these commons, we can look at them from a large scale globally or from a small scale. So some examples of global commons would be our atmosphere and our global oceans. Anybody on the planet can use those two things. Everybody on the planet breathes, so we're breathing in a certain amount of air. Anybody can go into the ocean, they can fish, provided they meet the requirements of getting fishing licenses and things like that. They can go out and swim at the beaches, they can go for a boat ride. It doesn't matter. They can use those oceans, they can use the atmosphere. Their usage, though, is benefiting themselves. It's not benefiting anybody else, only themselves. The damage they're doing to it is shared by everybody who has access to it. And that's where the tragedy of the commons comes in. It's going to be the tendency for a resource to become depleted And again, it has to be a shared and limited resource, meaning there's not a perpetual resource. It's eventually going to get destroyed. Perpetual resources are like sun and wind and things like that. Those that as soon as they're used, they're replenished immediately. This is going to be a shared, limited resource, and eventually it's going to become depleted because of self-interest and short-term gain. So when people are only looking out for their benefit, and they don't care about the damage they're doing, they're just trying to benefit as much as they can, inevitably that resource is going to get used to the point of destruction. And that's because if I don't use it, somebody else is going to. So why not make profit off of it, or why not gain access to it? Because if I don't do it, somebody else is. So that's going to be that whole idea of the tragedy of the common. And when we have too many people having access to it without agreement, this is a key point. Without agreement or regulation, then it's going to quickly become overused and destroyed. The agreements we can make could be through policy or law, where a government steps in and puts restrictions on, how many fish you can take from a lake, or if you walk off path at a park, you can get a fine for it. Laws on overgrazing of animals on public lands, different things like that. That could be the agreement, or it could just be a local agreement amongst friends. Say that I have a pond in my back, and not in my backyard, but say that there's a community pond in the neighborhood I live in. Anybody can go use that pond, but if there's no restrictions on it or regulations on it, then it's inevitably going to get destroyed. People are going to pollute it. People are going to overharvest the fish in it. So the agreement could just be kind of like a homeowners association, or even just me talking to my friends and say, hey, we need to manage and maintain that. Let's have one day a week where we're going to clean it up. That's the type of things we look for. If there's no agreement or regulation, then it gets overused and destroyed fairly quickly. And the tragedy of the commons can happen, in a matter of a few days or even a few hours in some cases. So we really need to make sure that those agreements and regulations are in place and that we're enforcing them. So Garrett Hardin was the person who came up with this. He wrote an essay and made headlines about it. Ended up, becoming recognized as one of the leading experts in the idea of the tragedy of the common. He was kind of the guy that literally wrote the book on it. So what he used was a grazing land pasture situation, where this area here, this grass, is available to any farmer that wants to use it to graze their animals. And in this case, they're grazing sheep. The 3 different farmers are in this field grazing sheep. And the individual sheep that they're putting in the field, it's not doing much damage. It's using the resource in a way that's going to be sustainable. So they're gaining access to the resource. They're all directly benefiting from it. They're gaining access to pasture land, so their sheep gets fed. It produces wool. They can sell the wool and make money off of it. So they're getting all kinds of profit each. So their profits are high. Now, the damage that those sheep are doing to the ecosystem is shared amongst all 3. So even though they're gaining access to the profit, it's a shared damage to it. So it's less impactful to any one individual because they're sharing the damage to it. So farmer A goes on and he's grazing a sheep, but then he's looking out and saying, hey, that grass, there looks like there is a lot more of it than what we need. So why don't I bring in a couple more sheep? Because again, I'm looking out for my self-interest. I want to make as much money as I can. So he brings in 2 more sheep. Farmer B and C just keep with the 1 sheep. Now farmer A drastically increased his profits. He's tripled them because now he has 3 sheep in it. So his profits have gone up considerably. He's gaining all the direct benefit of it. Now, the damage his sheep are doing is still shared amongst all 3 farmers. So even though the ecosystem, you can tell, is a lot less healthy, the grasses aren't green anymore, it's becoming overgrazed and trampled. You can see where there's kind of like the hills and things where the sheep have just pummeled the grass to the point where it's no longer living. They've eaten so much of it that it's no longer lush and green. So even though he's making all that profit, he's sharing the damage amongst all 3 farmers. So even though farmer B and C aren't increasing their profits, they're still sharing in the extra damage he's doing. So they're going to start looking out for their own self-interest, and they're going to say, well, if farmer A has 3 sheep, I'm going to bring in 3 sheep as well, and I'm going to increase the sheep that I have grazing in the pasture. And they might even go a step further and say, hey, instead of just 3, I'm going to bring in a 4th. Because he's done it for all those years. He's made all kinds of profit. I need to make some more profit. Farmer C, for instance, might say the same thing, and he might bring in 3 more sheep. Now they're all maximizing profit, but you can see there's huge amounts of damage done to the ecosystem. Eventually the grasses get destroyed and the ecosystem dies off. So what we see is by each farmer looking out for their own self-interest, the ecosystem gets destroyed very quickly. That's what the tragedy of the commons is all about. We can look at it from a local situation too. So think about our school building and the bathrooms in our school. Our custodians do a great job trying to keep the school clean, and they do an awesome job at it. Our school is one of the cleaner ones in the area if you go to any other schools. But our bathrooms, by the end of the day, we have 1,400 students at the school. Inevitably, with 1,400 kids having access to those bathrooms, they're going to get dirty by the end of the day. So you go into the men's restroom, for instance, and the urinals are up against the wall. Every third person might miss the toilet by a little bit at the start and pee on the floor just a little bit. But every third person doing that with 1,400 kids having access to that bathroom, inevitably that's going to result in a huge amount of urine being on the floor by the end of the day. So we have that local common resource of our bathroom. Nobody's regulating that bathroom. There's not a bathroom monitor in there making sure people aren't missing the toilet and peeing on the floor. There's not a bathroom monitor in there making sure people aren't clogging the toilets and leaving them, or letting toilet paper drop on the floor, or paper towels not finding their way into the garbage can. So since nobody's monitoring and maintaining it, there's no regulation, and everybody has equal access to it. It has open access. We're not saying that ninth graders have to use X bathroom and 10th graders have to use Y bathroom. We're saying everybody can use any bathroom in the school at any time. So when we look at that, there's no regulation, there's open access. Inevitably, it's going to become overused. And it's because everybody's looking out for their self-interest. When you need to go pee, you're going to find the quickest bathroom to get to. That quickest bathroom might be the same one that a lot of people are using based on where the classrooms are. So when we look at it, they're inevitably going to get overused because people have open access to them with no regulation. If we went and started to regulate the bathrooms, and now we had somebody in charge of making sure, like say, when you guys start going to fancier places and you go out to eat, sometimes there's people that work in the restrooms and they have like gum and breath mints and things like that and colognes and stuff that they can sell. If we were to regulate our bathrooms and we had somebody in the restroom doing that type of stuff, and in addition to us allowing them to sell their colognes and body sprays and things like that, if we said you're in charge of making sure people aren't destroying the bathroom, then we take that open access, no regulation, and we start putting regulations on it. That's going to keep it from getting overused and destroyed because now people are being forced into keeping up with the condition of it. It's not going to get destroyed. That helps to prevent the tragedy of the commons from happening. So when we look at this, again, no regulations whatsoever on here. The farmers aren't talking amongst themselves and saying, hey, how can we use this land more sustainably? Or there's no laws on it where the government's coming in and saying each person can only have 2 sheep because that's the maximum amount we can use it at without damaging it. Nobody's doing any of that stuff, so we can see that the ecosystem gets overused and eventually destroyed. So when we looked at it, we said in class, hey, let's take a break. Let's come up with 3 examples of commons and ways to mitigate the damage to them based on the tragedy of the commons. So we want to find ways to fix the overuse problem. A lot of people came up with regulating on their own. We didn't talk about regulation or anything before we did this, but they came up with regulation to help try to fix it. So the regulations they talked about were to pass policies and laws. Policies and laws only go so far, though, because you have to have people to enforce them. And if you're not charging money to go and use those resources, who are you going to pay to police those laws? We don't have enough park rangers and we don't have enough law enforcement officers to make sure that all the common spaces are protected. And eventually, again, we see overuse and damage to them. So those policies and laws, in theory, are good, but when you tie them to penalty, it's not as effective as if you tie them to incentive. So when we talked about how the people in the bathrooms in the restaurants and things that are selling, colognes and things like that, in addition, they're handing people paper towels and they're making sure those paper towels are getting thrown away. So they're gaining benefit by regulating that open access resource. They're getting the incentive of, hey, the business owner is going to allow you to go in there. They're going to allow you to profit off of it and make money. But in return, you're going to be regulating our resource for us. So when you incentivize the following of the policies and law, that does a lot more than penalizing. You can still tie it to penalties, but it's not as effective as if you were to incentivize. So if they were to ask you on the test, what's a way that we can mitigate the damage caused by overuse of a resource, get in the regulation and talking about the policies and laws, but try to tie them back into incentive bases where people are going to benefit by doing something. You could give tax breaks by ensuring sustainable usage. You could give access to it earlier than other people. So say that there's a public park, and if I vow that I'm going to become a steward of the park and I'm going to go and clean up litter and I'm going to help them maintain the trails and things like that to make sure that they're being used sustainably, I could gain early access to the area where I have certain perks and benefits to using it that other people don't get because I'm using it in a more sustainable way. The other way that we did this was to, you can set bag limits, for instance, if it's a fishery, you can say how many fish people could catch. The regulation is the key part to it. We want to make sure that it's regulated, but we want to make sure that it's regulated in an effective way. We can look at the global commons of the atmosphere, and we have regulations in place. However, the atmosphere is a global common, everybody has access to it. The United States is going to have different regulations than what Brazil does, and Brazil will have different regulations than what Nigeria does. So each of these people have equal access to that resource. It's a common space. However, by looking at the regulations they put in place, it's not equally enforced. So there's still that chance for the overuse and pollution of it. Say we're looking at pollution standards. Our EPA puts maximum amounts of pollution that we can put in. Say that we have X amount here in the United States. Brazil, though, might be considerably less than X. So, our amount of pollution we're putting up would be considerably less than Brazil. Nigeria would have even less than X and even less than Brazil's. So when we look at it, Nigeria, if they were at the same level of industrialization as we are, they could be in turn polluting the environment a lot more impactfully than what we could because of that regulation not being equal. So it's really hard to govern those global common access resources because again, we don't have a global governing body. We have the UN, and the UN puts restrictions, but the UN has a hard time enforcing it because local laws and individual countries' laws kind of supersede the UN laws. Even though we have to follow by UN policy and procedure, we still have the local governing bodies that are the ones that are going to be enforcing it. So it's really hard to monitor and maintain and eliminate the problems of those global commons. We have a better chance of regulating our local common access areas because, again, that's us doing it and only us doing it. So hopefully you guys understand the tragedy of the commons a little bit better. If you're still hazy on it, please come in and ask because it is a very, very important part. The next thing we're going to get into in the next video will be externalities and how those are going to affect us. So you guys can stop watching at this point, pick up with the next video whenever you guys get a chance.